I'm sure several of you watched the NCAA tournament conclude last week and saw exciting games and all that kind of thing. If there was one game you saw or heard about, it was probably the Gonzaga-UCLA game. And I didn't watch the game personally, but people have talked about one of the best college games that they've ever seen. And it ended in overtime with one of the Gonzaga players, Jalen Suggs, hitting about a 30-foot bank shot to win the game as the time expired. And it was an exciting moment. Gonzaga lost the next game, ruined the perfect season, but that's not the point. But the reality is we enjoy those types of moments. We enjoy those successful moments where we thrive or our team wins, whatever that looks like. And one of the terms in sports that I really like is a baseball term called a walk-off. And a walk-off is just that. Everybody literally walks off the field. See, baseball doesn't have a clock. There's no timer. And so a walk-off happens when the home team scores the winning run in the last inning. You don't have to wait to get all 3 outs. The game is over, so everybody literally just walks off the field. And it sounds anticlimactic, but I promise you it's not. It's really fun and exciting, and I've been able to be part of a few of those. I remember my senior year in college. It was a home game. There's a runner on second base, bottom of the last inning, score tied, 2 outs, and I'm up to bat. And I hit a line drive to right field, base hit, scores the runner, and we win and we celebrate. And it was great and it was fun. And those are just great moments as a team when that happens. Now, one of the things about walk-offs, last-second shots, whatever that may be, is usually they come with a sense of adversity. You would rather your team is up a lot by the end of the game. So you don't have to worry, you don't have to stress or any of that nature. But adversity is part of life. It's part of what we encounter on really an everyday basis. And God's people in the Old Testament are no exception to that. If you remember that they were exiled to Babylon, that Babylon came and destroyed Jerusalem and deported a lot of the people. And what would happen during this time is the conquering nation would identify the strategic leaders in the conquered nation to basically deport them, take them back to their own country. And what this would do is, on one level, it would prevent the nation that was conquered from having the organizational structure and leadership to have an uprising. It would really limit the people's ability to rally around leaders and cause problems for Babylon. But it also would raise the standard and the leadership ability of Babylon itself, of have all these high-capacity leaders, the nobles, the aristocrats, those who had all the schooling and that such. And one of the examples we find is in Daniel, where we have Daniel and Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego. But we do have to recognize that in this moment, when they were deported, when they were in Babylon, it was a pretty dangerous situation, because you can get indoctrinated real quickly with the other country. But Daniel was one who, he stayed true to that. Some of you may be familiar with the Daniel fast. So as Daniel was an up-and-coming leader, the king of Babylon wanted to invest in him, give him the best he could. But Daniel recognized the food that was presented to him didn't honor God. And so he had the Daniel fast, which is water and vegetables. Sounds terrible, but it was either vegetables or honoring or dishonoring God. That was his choice. And so when we have adversity, we have to make sure that we don't allow the context to shape us. We have to make sure that we stay true to God. Now, my sophomore year of college, I was part of basically the opposite side of the offensive spectrum, in the sense of I was on second base, and there's a batter, 2 outs, score tied, hits a line drive to center field, and he hit it really hard. And I'm not the fastest person, but I'm not slow. And I remember I knew I had to run fast in order to beat the throw at home, because the batter hit it hard. The center fielder was going to have the opportunity to throw me out. So I get to third, I round third, my coach waves me home, and I tell you, this is probably the best slide I've ever had. No, I jumped over a guy once. That was probably the best slide, but this is the best legitimate slide I ever had. And head first, got my hand around the catcher, touched the plate, safe, and we scored, and we win. It was awesome. And a lot of times I think we forget about the adversity of what got us to that situation, though. Because Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, Daniel, and all of God's people are deported at this point. And God gives instructions to them. He tells them what to do, and a key piece of those instructions are found in Jeremiah chapter 29. And I'm going to read from that in just a moment. But if you're familiar with the book of Jeremiah, you're probably like, ooh, we're going to go to verse 11. Jeremiah 29:11, which is important, which is a great verse. But we've got to make sure we start at verse 4 in order to understand verse 11. Because starting in verse 4 of Jeremiah chapter 29, the Lord is speaking to the captives, those who are exiled to Babylon from Jerusalem. And he tells them in verse 4, build homes and plan to stay. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Marry and have children. Then find spouses for those children so that you can have grandchildren. Multiply. Do not dwindle away. And work for the peace and prosperity of the city in which you are exiled. Pray to the Lord for that city, for its welfare will determine your welfare. Do not let your prophets and fortune tellers who are with you in exile trick you. Do not listen to their dreams, because they are telling you lies in my name. I have not sent them. You will be in Babylon for 70 years. Then I will come and do everything that I have promised, and I will bring you back home. Then we get to Jeremiah 29:11. For I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord. Plans to prosper you and not harm you. Plans to give you a future and a hope. But as God is starting these instructions, the first thing he says is, get comfortable, it's going to be a while. You don't build a home if you're going to just stay for a short while. Particularly in that context. In Jeremiah's context, they would have put up a tent or some type of temporary shelter. But God says, put down roots. Work to stay there. Plant gardens and eat the food they produce. Now, I recognize something like you always need a place to stay. You need some type of shelter. Gardens, they grow every year, and you get the fruit and the vegetables from those gardens, and you need to eat every year. But God is not saying, hey, this is not going to be a short while. It's going to be a long time. Have kids, have grandkids, multiply, keep going, prosper where you are. Even in the midst of adversity, even in the midst of trials and suffering, of questions, God says, prosper where you are. Don't long for something else, because it's going to be 70 years. He gives them a specific amount of time. And I like how God says, work for the peace and prosperity of the city. We have to make sure that we're real careful of what hills we choose to die on. We can be real tempted to be obstinate against all sorts of things, but God says, be high-functioning members of society. Contribute. Make it well. Make it good. Be the salt of the earth. Enhance what is happening. So participate in all of the things that are going on and help them honor God. Thrive where you are. Now, 70 years from a Jewish context is it's a long time regardless. But 40 years was their understanding of a generation. So God is saying for almost 2 full generations, you're going to be exiled. You're going to be living in a foreign land. You're going to be going through this adversity. So when we think of adversity in our lives, we think of maybe a season, a few months, a few weeks, maybe a few years. And God's saying for 70 years, for almost 2 generations, adversity is going to come. But then he ends with the promise of he knows what's happening. He's not doing this to harm us. He's got a good future for us. He's got something in store for us. But in the midst of adversity, we have to make sure we recognize we're called to thrive and prosper, work for the peace and prosperity of the city. So what he is saying here is we need to make sure we put ourselves in position to succeed. We need to make sure we put ourselves in a position to do the best, to enhance the world as much as we can. And when we're talking about putting ourselves in a position, it reminds me of a game my sophomore year of high school. We're playing in a Christmas basketball tournament. And I remember it was the 3rd quarter. One of our guys got fouled with 0.4 seconds left on the clock in the 3rd quarter. And he got 2 free throws. He made the first one. And there's really not much you can do at 0.4 seconds. For the most part, you're just waiting for the time to expire and go into the huddle between the 3rd and 4th quarter. But I told myself, I said, if the ball's anywhere near me, I need to tip it towards the basket. And so the guy shot the ball, hit the back of the rim, bounced straight back towards him. I jumped to the lane, tipped it with my left hand, and it went in. It was one of those things where whew, didn't expect that to happen, right? It's just one of those things. Had I not put myself in position, it wouldn't have happened. So God's saying, put yourself in position. But sometimes when we put ourselves in position, it's going to bring more adversity. Because that's what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we're going to look at Daniel chapter 3 a little bit to see their story. Because they were living in Babylon. They were living in a place that was contrary to God in every way, shape, or form. And King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, constructed this tower, this statue that was made of gold, that was 9 feet wide and 90 feet tall. That's really tall. That's a lot of gold to cover that statue. But then they gave the clear instructions. They had this dedication time. And the instructions were that whenever you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the lyre, the zither, the harp, the pipes, and other musical instruments, bow to the ground to worship King Nebuchadnezzar's gold statue. Anyone who refuses to obey will be thrown into the blazing furnace immediately. That was the context in which they were living. Now, we recognize that there's commandments that God has given. The second commandment we find in Exodus chapter 2, or 20, verses 4 and 5. You must not make for yourself an idol of any kind or an image of anything of the heavens and earth or the sea. You must not bow down to worship them. Right? Very clear instruction, black and white. There's this statue as an idol. The commandment says do not bow down to worship idols. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were in the middle of this time where King Nebuchadnezzar ordered them to bow down. They had a choice to make. What were they going to do? And as the story unfolds, we find that they did not bow down. Now, it doesn't say anything that they were being obstinate and making a show of the fact that they weren't bowing down. They just chose not to follow that. That was a hill to die on. That was something that was a non-negotiable for them that they could not cross. They could not do that. But some of the other leaders in Babylon noticed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and so they went and told Nebuchadnezzar. Right? He issued a clear order to bow down, and they didn't follow it. Well, Nebuchadnezzar, as you can imagine, was not happy. He was actually very mad about this. See, they had put themselves in a position that was compromised, a position that really wasn't real easy for them to get out of. So Nebuchadnezzar brings them to him, and he gives them one more chance. You know, we like chances. We like to have a chance. And that's what we're talking about at the end of the games, of we have chances, chances to succeed and thrive. See, that same game where I tipped in the ball at the third quarter, the score was tied with about 15 seconds left in the game. The other team had the ball, and they were waiting to get the last shot. And it's one of those things when you're on defense and the other team has the ball in basketball, you just don't want them to score. So really, the biggest objective for us was to not let them win the game. Well, they ran a play, and they threw the ball, or the guy shot the ball about a 10-footer and missed it. And I got the rebound with 5 seconds left. Now, I was a sophomore. I was a competent player, but I was not our best player by any means. We had 2 seniors that would have been the clear people to get the ball. But there wasn't time. So I remember I got the ball, and I immediately started dribbling down to our side of the court. Got to half court, right in the middle. One of their defenders cut me off, and so I went to the right, and I threw up a shot from 40 feet, nothing but net. And it did go in the hoop, too, not just the bottom of the net there. But and it was one of those things where we had a chance. We had the opportunity. And really, all we were thinking is, well, I hope we don't mess it up. I hope we don't lose. But then the tide can change. So we have to make sure we push through that adversity. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are confronted by Nebuchadnezzar. And they respond to him. He gives them one more chance, and they say no. And they tell him, we don't need to defend ourselves before you. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, our God can save us. He will rescue us from your power. But even if he does not, we want you to know that we will not serve your idols or bow down to your gold statue. They didn't compromise. They were living in this foreign place. They were living in a place of adversity, and they did not compromise. See, they didn't need to defend themselves. And I think a lot of times we get caught up in trying to defend God. We don't need to defend God. We just need to affirm who he is. And there's a difference there. We're not talking about being a defensive faith. We're talking about being an active follower of Jesus. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego recognized that God's power could save them, that God had the ability to do this, to rescue them. They affirmed who God was. That even if statement, I think that's a pretty powerful statement. It's one that speaks to us. It's one that recognizes that it's not a guarantee that God's always going to do good things for us. See, regardless of the consequences, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said, we're going to serve God. We're going to stay true to Him. Now, as I was thinking about all these sports memories, I thought of one that I think was a little bit ridiculous. I was playing slow bit softball, probably when I was 26, 27, and the field that we played on was real small. Almost everybody could hit a home run. And I remember I hit a walk-off home run that game. And it was about as anticlimactic as you can get because it put us up by 15, and it was a 15-run rule, right? But it was a walk-off. It ended the game. And so sometimes our moments through adversity aren't as exciting as we would like. Sometimes there's a different context. Sometimes we're more relieved that the game's over than anything else. So this is where Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, they find themselves in the middle of this adversity, and we're not sure how it's going to turn out. But as they get thrown into the furnace, a couple of things worth noting. You may remember that Nebuchadnezzar had the furnace heated 7 times hotter than normal, and that the soldiers who actually threw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego into the fire died because it was so hot. But in verses 24 and 25, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are walking around, and there's a 4th figure in there. Now, there's debate on scholars. Was that Jesus? Was that an angel? What was actually happening there? Well, they were protected from somehow in that furnace, and Nebuchadnezzar saw that. So, in verse 25, he calls out to them. Verse 26. He gets close to the furnace, and he shouts, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out, come here. So they walked out of the furnace, and everyone saw that the fire did not touch them. Not a hair on their heads was singed, and their clothes were not scorched. They didn't even smell like smoke. God rescued them like they knew He could. Now, it's one of those stories where it just affirms God's power, that no matter what someone wants to do to thwart God's plan, God can overcome it. God can make a way. He can provide a way for us to be saved in the midst of any adversity. They weren't harmed. And I love they weren't harmed. Their hair wasn't singed. Some of you don't have that problem, I guess. But their clothes weren't scorched. But they didn't even smell like smoke. You know, if you're around somebody who smokes, you smell like smoke. And that's not even that big of a fire, right? They were in the midst of it. They were right in the throngs of this fire, and they didn't even smell like it. Here's the problem that I find. Is I think too many times the church stops there and says, praise the Lord, let's go home and eat some supper or lunch or whenever it is. But what happens when it doesn't work out like that? All those sports memories that I gave you, if you can go back on them, if I didn't succeed in any of those moments, we still would not have lost the game. The score was tied in every single one of those, or it was not the end of the game. Or we were ahead by a bunch with the softball illustration. And I think sometimes that's where the church lives when it talks about God's power. That we forget that sometimes there's a time where God doesn't show up like we want. Sometimes we have to live in exile for 70 years. We have to go through all this adversity. I fear that the church has this pie-in-the-sky mentality, at least when we're talking. And so those outside of the church see how the church talks about Jesus, so that's not life. But I also fear that there are people inside the church that say, why isn't God showing up for me? So the question I have to ask is, praise the Lord for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but what do we do when we get to Stephen? You may remember Stephen in Acts chapter 6 and 7. The Church was exploding. The movement of Jesus was just going gangbusters. Things were happening. Lives were being changed. It was awesome. And so the apostles realized that there was too much for them to handle. So they appointed other leaders, and Stephen was one of those leaders. And he was specifically appointed to help with the food ministry, to distribute that, to help with the poor. And it's noted that he was full of the Holy Spirit. And it's also noted that he did miraculous signs. So the religious leaders were paying attention to Stephen. They noticed him. They were threatened by him. They wanted to get rid of him. So they brought him with charges of blasphemy, of speaking against God and degrading God in every way. And they had this trial that was not really much of a trial. And Stephen ended up lecturing them about the Old Testament, about Moses and Abraham. And Stephen essentially put them in their place. And we get to the end of Acts chapter 7, verses 57 and 58. And tells us that they put their hands over their ears, the religious leaders. They begin to shout, and they rushed at Stephen. They dragged him out of the city and stoned him. That's how Stephen's story ends. What do we do with that? You know, it's real fun to talk about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's not real fun to talk about Stephen. Because we don't want to be like Stephen. We want to be successful. We want to thrive. We want to win the game. We want to do the best we can. And that's what we want from God. But sometimes it doesn't happen. Sometimes life just doesn't work like we want it to. So I brought a little prop here. This is my most prized personal sports memorabilia. Someone rebuked me for not having written on this what this represents. It's one of those things I don't need a reminder. I just know. And I know because had I not been successful, we would have lost the game. And the odds were stacked against me that we should not have won. But yet we did. In fact, I remember this was my freshman year of high school, and they walked the batter in front of me to get to me. But yet we were successful. And it's a reminder of this is the possibilities. But I also see this ball, and I recognize there's a lot of failure that I don't want to talk about. There's a lot of times where I didn't get the ball at the end of the game. See, when I hit a home run with this ball and we won the game, and it was a great moment. I remember the next year, I made an error that essentially ended our season. I also remember my junior year of high school in our county basketball tournament. I missed a shot to win the game. And one of the real depressing things about that was I shot it and I was like, oh, that's in, and it was an air ball. I remember there was time in college where I had a diving play that I missed, and it lost the game for us. Remember a game in 7th grade where I was catching, and I just missed the ball. Pitcher threw a ball that I just missed it. Pass ball, runner on third, guy scored. We lost 1-0 to the eventual state champions. I remember those too. It's a lot more fun to talk about this ball. But I'll tell you what, if I don't talk about those other ones, then I'm missing something. Because following Jesus is not about pie in the sky mentality. It's about saying, regardless of the consequences, I'm going to serve Jesus. Regardless if he's going to save me from the fire or not, I'm going to serve Jesus. That's where we have to land. That's why we have to have these hard conversations about memories that aren't good, about when we failed, about when things didn't work out as good as we have liked them to. See, the church is not a place where people share testimony just about the good things. It's about how God taught us something. How God was there even though it didn't work out as I would like it to have worked out. Because I'm confident you have disappointments in your life that you say, man, I wish that would have been different. You may be an optimistic person. You may see the glass is half full. But there are things in your life that if you would go back and say, God, could you just change this one thing? But it's not about controlling God. And it's not about my reputation. I think that's what we have to get beyond. If God doesn't show up in a way that appeals to me, it's not as though my reputation is tarnished, because God has tied his reputation to us. So Stephen dying was not God failing. I don't know how God worked it out. I don't know why God uses those types of things. But regardless of how it is, we have to make sure we have the good and the bad. Because if we only talk about the good, we only have half a relationship there. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego is a fantastic, inspiring story. But so is Stephen. It's a little more difficult to digest. But my prayer for you today is that even if statement, even if God doesn't show up, I'm still going to serve him.